It's the week ending Saturday the 4th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the release of murderer Colin Pitchfork after 33 years in prison, Dame Sarah Storey becoming Britain's most successful ever Paralympian, and after months of protests, the death of Geronimo, the alpaca, who twice tested positive for bovine TB. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Mr. Joe Evans, from the Week USA, Jessica Hullinger, and from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, lecturer Abdulwahab Tahhan. He's originally from Syria, you know. He might mention that. Joe, you're kicking us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The surprise rise of Olaf Scholz.
First of all, Angela Merkel and I collaborated very well together for a very long time. I served as the Minister of Labor in the first Merkel administration, then represented one of the states as mayor and was in regular contact with the federal government. And now I am Minister of Finance and Vice Chancellor. That, of course, helps with everything I have on my upcoming agenda for the next chapter. I have a good and clear plan for the 2020s, for what we have to do, how we ensure more respect in our society, and how we can create the economic foundation necessary for good jobs in 10, 20 or 30 years.
Olaf Scholz giving his full LinkedIn profile there to DW News last month. Joe, who is he and what's the story?
So Olaf Scholz is the SPD party in Germany's candidate for Chancellor. And the news this week is that Germany's Social Democrats, his party, have pulled ahead of Chancellor Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democratic Union, for the first time in 15 years, according to a series of polls, which have been published just a month before the country's federal election. The election will be marked by Merkel standing down as Chancellor after 16 years in office and 4 election victories.
And that is quite a comeback, isn't it? Because as recently as June the 30th, his party, the SDPs, were struggling in third place on just 14% in the polls, behind the CDU and the Greens. So what's happened?
Yeah, it is something of a surprise, and the spike in support has surprised even commentators that watch Germany very, very closely. Scholz isn't exactly the most charismatic leader in the world. The party has an ageing membership, many of the hallmarks that have impacted social democratic parties across Europe. There is some suggestion that the reason for the rise in the SPD support is somewhat voter fatigue, that people are very used to Christian Democratic Union's leadership of the country and they want to change. And also, as I just mentioned, the election is being marked by Angela Merkel standing down, and there is some suggestion that Merkel had managed to pull together a coalition of voters for the CDU, that their new candidate for Chancellor, Armin Laschet, just simply isn't being able to hold together.
But Jess, Laschet appeared on course for an easy victory until that new poll came out. So is it his fault? Has he done something wrong, or is Merkel just too hard an act to follow, as Joe was indicating?
I think it's a little bit of a combination of both. It seems like they've sort of served up a candidate that doesn't have a whole lot of appeal. And also he's been caught on camera making a number of gaffes. One of them recently was he was laughing while visiting the sites of the floods that hit in July, which were devastating. And so those gaffes have really hurt him. But also I think that it's worth talking about Scholz's campaign spin. So he's positioning himself as the sort of continuity candidate, which is really interesting because he's an opposition party to Merkel's party. So it's been this really interesting branding that they've done. And, he's pitching himself as being, someone who will carry on Merkel's sense of stability and really keep things stable. And I think that's really interesting, considering, like I said, he's an opposition candidate.
And also, Abdul, with himself very much at the centre of the campaign. He said recently at a Berlin rally, if you want Olaf Scholz as Chancellor, you have to vote SPD. That doesn't really suggest stability and long-term thinking, does it, when a leader is more popular than their party?
Well, a leader might not be that popular in their party, but I think they're really campaigning really hard. I give you an example of my brother who lives in Kiel in Germany. And the other day I was talking to him, and for the first time, he's been living there for 10 years. For the first time, some people knock on his door and ask him if he's interested to vote. And they were from this party, and that I wasn't really aware of that I was going to be talking about today. So my brother, while he was not really convinced with their message, he wasn't going to vote for them. but it is the first time he sees people from a party knocking on his door, asking people to vote. So this is a great start for him, I think, and for the party. So they're pushing hard, I think, and they're trying to get some people who haven't voted before. My brother has never voted before in his life, not there in Syria or in Germany, but he's a German citizen now, so he's eligible to vote. So I think there might be in a position to lead if they can get these voters from everywhere.
And it's not as straightforward as it seems, is it, Joe? Because you've got this guy out front who is, as Jess was alluding to, kind of positioning himself as continuity and centrism. But the party behind him is much more left of Merkel. It's in the same way as the Labour Party was under Corbyn, as I understand it, kind of been taken over by people who want it to go further to the left.
No, you're quite right. And I think actually the more astute comparison is perhaps to Keir Starmer, who's trying to lead the party down a more centrist track, but has obviously got the wing of supporters that Corbyn attracted to the Labour Party behind him.
But in this case, Scholz isn't even the party leader, is he? It's kind of like you're putting Keir Starmer forward to be Prime Minister, whilst behind the scenes you've still got Momentum who are going to be running the Treasury.
Sort of. You're right to say that it would be a massive political revival for Scholz if he was able to secure the Chancellery after the election later this month. And it should be noted that in 2017 he lost an election to become the party's candidate to two candidates from the left of the party, who then stepped down because the party dropped very rapidly in the polls and it was suggested that they couldn't win an election. But as Jess has said, Scholz is seen by lots of Germans as a very steady pair of hands. He's currently Minister of Finance and has got a lot of experience running various ministries. It's interesting, as Jess said, that he's positioned himself as a continuity candidate because he is supposedly in opposition, but he is trying to pull together this very broad coalition of voters in much the same way that Merkel has successfully done for 15 years, who are not necessarily traditional SPD voters, just as Merkel's base weren't traditional CDU voters. And so in that sense, he is very much a continuity candidate in that he's essentially trying to pull off the same trick that Merkel has very successfully pulled off for a very long time.
Kevin Kühnert, who is one of the deputy leaders of the SDP, is more leftist, isn't he? He has called for leading German companies such as BMW to be seized from their owners and collectivised. He said there should be no place for private landlords in Germany. Jess, this could be a big change for Germany, couldn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it could be. I mean, I'm sure Joe can talk a bit about it, but it depends on what his coalition plans end up being, right? So it depends on who he has to join forces with. The party won't want to join forces really with the CDU again, probably. So I guess it could go a couple of ways. The SPD could join forces with the Greens and also with the Left Party and could be quite a far left coalition, or could join up with the Greens in a sort of pro-business FPD, which means that there would be a very broad mix of interests in that coalition. And in some ways, they might cancel each other out and do absolutely nothing. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes next. I mean, Scholz has not given much indication about what the plan is and seems to be leaving the door open to whatever the voters want. So, yeah, I mean, the lot is hanging in the balance for sure. It could mean change or it could not.
Regardless of coalitions, Abdul, if the SPD were to win, it would be the return of social democratic politics, centre-left politics on the European stage and therefore the worldwide stage, perhaps for the first time really in 20 years since its heyday. That is a change for the world.
Oh, well, that is a change for the world, but that's a big shoe to fill after Merkel has left. But to be honest with you, I'm not really concerned of what's going to happen there. I'm only concerned about one thing, which is how am I going to be affected? Like, as you said, I'm from Syria. I'm going to mention it. So there are over 1.2 million refugees in Syria. How are they going to be affected by that? Merkel was very, very welcoming to Syrian refugees and to refugees in general, like one of the largest countries in Europe that have taken refugees over the years. Last year alone, they had over 36,000 refugees. Now, are the SPD going to continue that? Are they going to provide any integration for refugees? Are we going to see any change in that? Because Merkel was criticized for her welcoming policy regarding refugees, especially when she wanted to bring a lot of highly skilled refugees such as doctors and engineers into Germany. So what is that going to be like? I checked their policies. I didn't really see much on refugees, so I'm not really sure what's that going to be like.
It's interesting that Abdul raises that, actually, because the most obvious comparison right now is what's happening in Afghanistan. And actually, Scholz has done very well out of the Afghanistan crisis. He's polls higher than any of the candidates on his foreign policy positions. Germany is currently in a bit of a dispute with itself, really, over what's over Afghanistan, and similarly is having to negotiate with the EU about putting numbers on how many refugees to accept. And it has also been suggested that the EU could spend around 300 million euros trying to resettle refugees in order to try and avoid the scenes that were seen in sort of 2014 to 2016, when, as Abdul refers to, Merkel was incredibly welcoming, but the bloc as a whole massively mismanaged a mass migration of people. So it should be said that on that particular issue, Scholz does poll very well, and he is seen as a safe pair of hands, which in many ways is another way that he's seen as a sort of continuity candidate with Merkel, because certainly other CDU candidates and other CDU politicians don't hold Merkel's position on refugee policy.
And to return to my point, Joe, about the return of the centre-left, do you think if the SPD were to win that this could reverse PASOKification? And you're going to have to define that for us.
Yes, so you refer there to the hollowing out of PASOK, Greece's main centre-left party, which lost a massive percentage of its vote between sort of 2000 and 2015. It should be said that PASOK is used as an example of something that happened to centre-left parties all over Europe, which essentially saw out a hollowing of their support base, largely due to the fact that the industrial working class and unions from which social democratic parties have traditionally drawn their support have substantially eroded. Europe's population has got older, which traditionally results in more people voting with slightly more of a conservative slant. And then, of course, also the financial crisis, which forced parties like PASOK to adopt policies being adopted across the West, like bailing out banks and imposing austerity. PASOK eventually saw their voter base hollowed out, and the anti-austerity party Syriza, famous in the UK for having Yanis Varoufakis as their finance minister, eventually won power, but also there was a party from the far right called Golden Dawn that also gained some support. Whether or not Scholz winning is an example of that being reversed, I'm not sure. You've seen the same phenomena happen in Germany, where Alternative for Deutschland, which is a very far-right anti-migrant party, rose in popularity, and also the Greens and Die Linke to the left of the SPD have also seen a surge in support. What will likely end up happening is that Scholz will govern as part of what's called a traffic light coalition in Germany because of the colours of the parties. It's red, green, yellow, the SPD, the Greens, and the Free Democrats, who Jess said earlier are a conservative, liberal, free market party. So whether or not this is a sort of the first step in a fight back for European social democracy, I'm not sure. What it does suggest is that maybe those trends which have sort of, as I say, hollowed out the centre-left voter base over the last 2 decades may be slightly in reverse. But we should also be careful, I think, about drawing too huge a conclusion from this, because we are talking about one of Europe's wealthiest countries, a country with very high levels of education, high levels of general contentment. And so seeing those anti-austerity policies and those things reverse in Germany may not necessarily be the case across the bloc.
I'll be really curious to see what happens with the Green Party as well. I mean, I was surprised at how popular they were in the sort of polling leading up to the debates and leading up to the actual election at the end of September. You know, if they do end up being a large part of the coalition, it'll be really interesting to see what kind of green energy tech comes out of this. So Scholz is pledging stronger climate protections, and he's saying that he'll turn Germany into a leader of exporter of green innovations and technology, which is obviously a really big hot button issue globally. So that'll be really interesting as well.
Okay, Jess, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Jess, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Well, this was a really bad week to need a blood test in Britain.
When hospitals struggle to add intensive care units and thousands of beds, you find a way to provide the equipment and devices they need to care for patients. When supply chains are stretched to the breaking point, you go to the well. You call on your people and partnerships to get the essential technologies of diagnosis, treatment, and discovery to the labs, the hospitals, and the workers who are saving lives.
65,000 people, one human hope, a video released last year by medical technology company Becton Dickinson. You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Jess, what's the story?
This week, the NHS was forced to temporarily stop all but the most urgent blood tests due to a really drastic shortage in test tubes that are used to collect blood samples. So NHS England told GPs and hospitals to stop testing for things like infertility, prediabetes, allergies, things that we may not consider essential, but that obviously a lot of people have issues with. And they have to do this until the shortage eases, which is possibly a few weeks, but it could be a bit longer. And doctors and care providers say that this is forcing them to make some really tough decisions about who gets a blood test, and could also potentially make them miss very important diagnoses.
And just to return to the brief of the show, Jess, repercussions for all our lives. Obviously, if we're waiting for a blood test from the NHS in England, this is going to affect us in the short term. But I'm presuming you've chosen this story because the long-term implications of this go beyond blood tests. It hints at an issue that might keep repeating on us.
Yeah, this is really a sort of a microcosm of what's been happening with global supply chain problems in general. So just to explain what's happening with the NHS, they get most of their special test tubes for these blood tests from a company, like you said, called Becton Dickinson. And this company says that it's been overwhelmed for demand by people who are experiencing COVID, and they need to have various tests done. And also there's this surge in procedures that were put off earlier in the pandemic in the UK. And now that we're seeing those trying to pick back up, there's a big supply crunch. So the company says that the problem is not only just a surge in demand, but also that the supply chain has been disrupted, that there are problems at the UK border, shortfall of lorry drivers, all those things that we've heard about. But again, coming back to the sort of global supply chain, COVID has really disrupted that. We're seeing this in various products that we're missing right now. Shelves in stores are a bit empty. I saw yesterday that there was like a beer shortage, all those things that don't really matter, but it does matter when it comes to healthcare, right? So, and especially with the NHS, the way that the NHS works in terms of supplying providers with products, drugs, is that they use a sort of something called a just-in-time supply chain model. And a lot of companies use this. A lot of businesses use this because it helps them save money. But it means that they only order the materials that they need right now, the things they need right before they're projected to be needed. So there's never a sort of backlog. They never store things. They never stockpile. This is cheaper. There are fewer storage costs and there's less waste. But it only works if every part of the supply chain runs like a well-oiled machine. And right now, that's just not happening. I mean, especially most of it comes down to COVID and the fact that we rely so heavily on China for many, many things, and especially drugs. I think the statistic is that globally, 70% of all base ingredients for drugs are manufactured in China.
Yeah, well, on that, let's go to Abdul, since you're in Hong Kong. Do you think that should be concerning for any country to rely on 70% of any product category from any country?
I think this should be concerning only if we expect the pandemic to be prolonged. But nowadays, the supply chain was always reliable for years and years. China pretty much makes all the world's products, from Nike shoes to Adidas. We've never had any shortage of that. The blood tube tests are only in shortage now just because of the coronavirus. So it's not because of any political issues. It's not because of any specific thing other than the pandemic. And a couple of weeks ago, China closed the third largest port in the world for like 6 days because of COVID outbreak there. So maybe that was another reason why it was affected. But I don't think in this time, in 2021, countries would be worried about manufacturing 70% of their needs from another country.
I mean, Joe, it may not be about political issues now, but it highlights that if one day it was, we could very easily be cut off.
No, that's quite right. It somewhat reminds me of the phrase that the UK is only ever 2 meals from anarchy, in that you only have to cut off the supply of something for a very short period of time before everything goes completely wrong. It should be said that the solutions to these sound incredibly simple and in practice are actually incredibly difficult. The first one is obviously, expanding the pool of suppliers that deliver things to the UK, which is very difficult because, as we've discovered with PPE, there are not many companies that produce these things on mass scale that can provide for a service as big as the NHS, for example. The second one is obviously making and storing more products in the UK, which again sounds immensely simple, but setting up a factory to produce, again, as we've seen with PPE, in a short period of time is very, very difficult. And so that does require investment in talent, investment in production facilities. That's going to take a very, very long time and will require attracting top scientific brains to do the work for us. And so it's not something with a short-term fix. And I agree with Jess, actually, that it is worrying and slightly frightening precedent that the COVID pandemic is a very large disruption to the supply chain, but even far smaller ones could produce shortages like the ones we've seen this week.
Yeah, let's talk about the lorry driver issue, Jess, because as you hinted at, that's part of this as well, which, as far as I can see, seems mostly to be about Brexit rather than COVID, i.e. there are a lot of EU citizens that have gone home, quote unquote, and aren't here anymore to drive the lorries.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there was a really great Twitter thread from a lorry driver trying to explain sort of what was happening and why. And he was talking about how, nobody's ever really wanted to do the job of driving trucks. And there's always been a shortage of drivers, but that now it's sort of crunch time. There's a big delay due to COVID in obtaining a license for driving lorry trucks. I can't remember exactly what the number is, but it's months. And so there's a massive backlog of people trying to get licenses. And also many of the people who did drive the trucks have had to go home because of Brexit. And so, yeah, there's a huge shortage. And he sort of ended his Twitter thread by saying he'd come in to work and suddenly there was a £7 hourly pay rise, I think it was. And he said it's just out of nowhere because they can't find anybody to do these jobs. And so they're trying to pay people more. And he hinted, where do you think that money is going to come from? Who's going to pay for that? And it's going to be us right at the other end on products. But yeah, the lorry driver situation is huge. And I think he also talked a little bit about how we maybe haven't noticed it because the industry has been really resilient, worked really hard to cover up any gaps. But that it's kind of starting to show.
It should be said, actually, just to pick up on Jess's points about that lorry driver pointing out that he'd received a £7 pay rise and linking it back to Brexit, it does to some extent show the short-sightedness of that political project and the campaign promises made by that political project. Because, pay rises for British workers was something that they parroted throughout the campaign and is unarguably a good thing. It's unarguably a good thing that people that are paid poor wages to do very physically intense and mentally straining work. The issue with that is, of course, that the only way you facilitate a very rapid and sudden pay rise for people in low-paid work is that you have to have a very short, sudden shock to the economy. And the reality is that that's the side of the Brexit campaign that wasn't explained and wasn't necessarily slapped on the side of a bus.
Yeah, so in the case of a private company, delivering groceries to a supermarket or something, paying more to their lorry drivers, Abdul, that would probably be us, the consumers, paying more. In the case of the NHS, if you ditch the just-in-time supplier model, if you try and innovate new ways to create test tubes in Britain, whatever the solution is, that also is going to end up with the consumers, i.e. in that case, the taxpayer, us, paying more. However you look at this problem, we are all going to be paying more for stuff.
It is always us paying more, that's right. But it's not only about money, it's about people's health and lives. It's invaluable and you cannot really put money on it because now the guidelines for the NHS sent to doctors and GPs that they can only test those who are in urgent cases. And the problem is this puts the doctors as the face of the problem. Like the NHS kind of asking the doctors and the hospitals to burden the problem, something they didn't do or they didn't even plan. As much as we are proud of the NHS, a lot of people are looking at the planning of NHS now, and from the PPE shortage of the PPE now to the shortage of blood tubes, and I'm really wondering who is in charge and who is running all of this to decide what we get and what we don't, and why pretty much the UK is the one facing all these problems.
Yeah, and Jess, it's sort of straightforward in a way to say what's the most urgent blood test. That would be cancer or HIV or something. But to say what's the least urgent, that's a very subjective thing. It's not actually what even GPs are qualified to do. They only ask for blood tests if they think they're important in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. No GP is running a blood test just out of habit, because they want to. These are tough decisions to make anyway. And I was thinking about what if my son was sick and I had to take him to the hospital and they had to sort of weigh up whether or not it was worth testing his blood. And I found that really gutting, which is why I found this so surprising. This is really the human face of this problem. It's not just that our shelves are devoid of some of the products that we like. It's that people could have life-saving procedures denied of them because doctors are having to make really tough decisions. It's worth mentioning There is some good news here. So Becton Dickinson has ramped up imports now to help with the shortage. And it's only allowed to do that because it's been given special approval to bring in test tubes that are approved in other places. So hopefully that will help a little bit. But yeah, this is a much bigger problem, and that won't solve that issue.
I think what Jess just said is really important, actually, and her point about if your child was sick and you had to take them to the hospital and they needed a blood test and weren't able to get one, it's hugely damaging to preventative medicine, because so many things that aren't obvious and aren't the pressing issue that you've gone to hospital to have looked at are picked up through blood tests, that delaying what aren't necessarily, emergency blood tests or blood tests for very clear and emerging problems will result in lots of things being missed. And we've already seen that during the COVID pandemic, with people not going to their GP or not going to hospital with things like, cancer scares or potential illnesses that further down the line become, in their worst, fatal. And this is just yet another delay to that kind of preventative medicine, which has been set back so much in the last 18 months.
I also feel really bad for women who are experiencing infertility. I mean, infertility was on that list. And during COVID, and when non-essential procedures were sort of put on the back burner, fertility problems were one of those things. A lot of people struggled to get IVF consultations and treatments. And yeah, I mean, it may not seem essential, but to a lot of people it is. It's life-changing not to be able to try and have a kid when you want to. So yeah, it's just a bit sad for women seeking infertility treatment.
Okay. Abdul, I'm coming to you next after this. Abdul, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It was game over for Chinese kids.
In business tonight, young Chinese gamers are not happy with new rules that limit gaming time. They're taking to social media to vent. The new measures bar under 18s from playing video games for more than 3 hours a week. Beijing says the new rules are necessary to stop growing addiction to what it describes as spiritual opium.
Eugenia Lim reporting for Singaporean news channel CNA on Tuesday. Abdul, did I hear that right? China are banning kids from playing video games.
You're absolutely right. So China has banned under 18 from playing video games throughout the week. They are only allowed to play for 3 hours, 1 hour on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. So these are the only 3 hours they're allowed to play online video games. Now, this is one of the things that has been reported. The other things that have not been reported, such as changes like not giving homework to students from year 1 to 3, giving homework to students that can be finished within 1 hour for year 4 to 6, increasing PE classes for students in primary schools, and increasing school time, because now school finishes around 4 o'clock, and they're increasing the time for parents to come and collect their children from school so that they do not depend on their grandparents. So there's a lot of different measures that are put in here. Gaming was one of them, but it was the most controversial thing.
Yeah, and so they're being presented in China as a public health intervention then. So all those things you mentioned, you can wrap those up as a policy of, we've looked at what's affecting children's health, in this case mental health, and we've made some changes.
They have made some changes, but these are only for online gaming. Kids can still play, for example, PS4, PS5, but these are not very popular in China. The most popular games are the ones you see on your phone. And these games are designed for adults, and you have to pay a lot of money. And kids have been playing these games using their parents' credit cards or whatever card. So the parents got really annoyed or not really happy about it. So they thought that these measures are good for them. They're not good for the kids. So I think here the state kind of took parenting's role in here.
Okay, but is it evidence-based? I mean, can they say, we know that online gaming has been harming children's mental health and that's why we're intervening? Is there any backing up of that?
They can claim that this is evidence-based. I mean, no country ever, or no politician would say, no, this is just because this is what we wanted. They can claim this, but for me, I haven't seen any evidence that online video games can harm people. I mean, there are some studies that show that online games could affect students badly, negatively, or positively in both sides, wherever you want it. So it's open for interpretation.
Jess, you're a parent, as you alluded to earlier. How would you feel about the state telling you when your children can play video games?
Oh, I mean, I probably would really hate it. I don't know. I mean, my kid is very young and doesn't play video games yet, but I just think we've been hand-wringing over video games for a really long time, and there does still, for years, we have been trying to find evidence that it is harming our kids, and the evidence is not there. It's just not there. And in fact, there's evidence to the contrary. I mean, there's research that suggests that video games actually can do great things for creativity. They can help kids find connection, especially in, our COVID times where a lot of things are happening online. They can do wonders for helping to instill a love of tech and technical skills and problem solving, decision making. I mean, it's not just passively sitting in front of a television and watching TV. It's video games. You have to be an active participant, and there's a lot of brain power that goes into that. And there was one study that found that performance in strategy video games can be an indicator for managerial competence among job applicants. So, yeah, I mean, I find that argument that video games are bad for kids to be a bit silly, but I also think it's interesting to talk about what this could mean for China's youth. I mean, I'm not arguing that kids should sit and play video games all day, but there is an issue. So Tai Kim at Bloomberg argues that the crackdown could mean that China's kids face the prospect of falling behind their American counterparts in getting exposure to critical areas of innovation. So, yeah, I think it's quite silly.
But they're already top performers educationally, the Chinese, aren't they, Joe? I don't think they'd have made this change if they thought that their generation of children were really going to fall behind. I presume they've assessed that they'd be better off. Reading books is the classic sort of phone-in example to give, but I suppose that is the kind of thing people will be doing more of if they're not in front of their video game.
Well, Abdul has just said that the state here has taken on the role of the parent, and I instinctively balk at the state acting in a paternal or maternal manner. I think this is a slightly farcical face of what is essentially totalitarianism. It's another extension of the state intervening in people's lives in China in such a way that they shouldn't be invited to do, and it should be rejected. I don't think anybody living in the West should sort of scoff or laugh at this. It's yet another example of the state going into people's homes and telling them what they can and can't do. It should be said that it is also part of a wider shift in Beijing to take more control over various areas of society and the economy, and tech, education, property. All of these areas have fallen under greater scrutiny. The example that comes to mind is that the CPC has just launched an investigation into corruption in Hangzhou, which is one of the country's biggest booming tech cities. So it comes at a time that the Chinese Communist Party is looking to expand its reach into society, and as I say, I think this is just the farcical face of what is essentially totalitarian politics.
But some people, Abdul, in the West will be envious of what the Chinese government are able to do. They might say it's coming from a place of totalitarianism, as Joe was suggesting, but we've had a problem here, for example, of people using online games, paedophiles using online games, extorters using online games to talk to young children, and we can't do anything about it because here we can't force people to use their legal names. The Chinese have done that. In this country, David Cameron 10 years ago was talking about preventing access to pornography to under 18s. That is still not the case. You go to a porn site and it's all there. So a lot of people would say the Chinese have actually got some of this right.
Well, it's part of it, right? I mean, kids under 18s can still play games for kids, designed for kids. These have not been banned. The games that have been banned are also designed for over 18. The ones kind of, you pay money for that. But there are a lot of games that teach you how to, playing with others and decision-making, all these have not been banned. So they can still play them. Now, because the party can pretty much make any policy they want and companies would have to follow. So they can kind of do things however they want it and however they find fit. But one of the things that I kind of disagree with Joe here is that the state has the moral authority to defend children. So, for example, in the West, if you spank your children or hit your children or beat your children, the state will take your children away. And this is not stepping in and telling you what you can and you cannot do, but in order to protect the children. The state in here in China, whether sees that online games have been the new addiction for kids, and this is something I see in my class. To be honest, I don't think my classes are boring, but students most of the time are playing games, and this is not something I'm happy about. But hey, they are over 18, so they can still play games while I get paid, so I don't care.
Yeah, I also thought that was interesting too. Is that this? Adults can still play games as much as they want to. I mean, kids are not the only ones who can be, quote, addicted to video games, right? So there's no crackdown here on anyone over the age of 18.
No, but that's the case with gambling, for example, as well, isn't it? We acknowledge that gambling is addictive, but that if you're an adult, you might find it easier to make that decision about whether you want to be involved in something that's addictive, and or your brain will be more developed to be able to make that decision. Whereas, I mean, it is common sense that these are addictive things, whether there's evidence or not. We know they're designed to be addictive. They're designed to make you spend more money. They're designed to make you spend more time using them. They have clever people developing them to do that. Is that an appropriate vice to just hook children into?
I would like to see the evidence that there's harm done to kids' brains. I really would. I mean, we've been arguing that video games are addictive for a long time, but I want to see the longevity of that, and whether or not there is any evidence that suggests that there is a long-term effect. And I just don't think it's out there. I think it's a scare tactic for parents, and I think that it causes them a lot of anxiety, but I don't think the science backs it up.
And I would just also quickly reject the comparison between the state's responsibility to protect children and this particular ban. I think there's a marked difference between, for example, as Abdul suggested, hitting your child and allowing them to play video games. This is as parents see fit, and the state has no right to tell a parent how they should or should not raise their child in this regard, I don't think.
I think the surveillance part of it is also really interesting, right? I mean, you alluded to this a little bit, Olly, in that the state has required video game makers to implement facial recognition, right? So that they can confirm who is actually playing the game and keep track of them, basically. Everybody has to use their real names. There's no hiding. I mean, there is a surveillance aspect here, which I find more troubling than the idea of a kid playing video games in general.
I mean, again, that's the extension of the totalitarian state, isn't it?
Yeah.
But Jess, if everyone uses their real name on social media, doesn't that help with stopping racism? Especially after what we see every time England loses, or I don't know, a black player misses a goal or something, or we always have unlimited messages of abuse and racism, and still cannot stop them. So if everyone uses their real name and ID, isn't that easier to track these people and stop them and get rid of racism? This is one of the aspects that people here kind of talk about.
Yeah, I could definitely see that side of the argument. I could also see the flip side of surveillance being a huge problem and people using their real name and being outed or being targeted, or there are good and bad things to being able to hide yourself. And I think, especially if we're talking about young kids, allowing them some form of anonymity might actually be a good thing.
I'm just curious, since you've all laid your cards on the table now, what your gaming status is. What was the last video game that you played, Abdul?
The last one I played was Counter-Strike. That was before leaving Syria. And then I saw the real thing and I was like, yeah, I'm out of here.
Joe?
Mine is not that good, but it was probably over a decade ago that I last played a video console, or at least I owned a video console. I may have played one at a friend's house or something.
Go on, I want a title.
Oh, it would have been some sort of gratuitous shooting game, I'd have thought.
Look, he finds it too dismissive to even say the name of the thing, or at least he's supporting the rights of people to play them. Jess?
I don't remember. It was years ago. It was probably Mario Kart.
Yeah, that was a good one. I actually did get completely addicted to video games about the age of 16, and I just have never really played one since, apart from Tetris, if there's ever an excuse to play Tetris.
And you're fine, Olly. You're
I'm sort of fine. I'm not sure people would look at my career, or the Chinese state would anyway, and say, well, that's the kind of person we want our children to develop into.
We'll send you as an envoy, Olly, to meet Xi Jinping and explain to him that you're absolutely fine.
On which note, our allotted time for this week is over. We're only allowed up to 45 minutes of news discussion each week, government mandated. My thanks to Jess, Abdul and Joe for their stories. Remember to follow this show for free. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.